To welcome you to the last session of the conference today. I'm Laurel Bestock. For those of you who don't know me, I'm an Egyptian archaeologist here at Brown. Our two speakers in the last session, I'm very pleased to announce, I will announce you both from the beginning. Robert Rollinger from the University of Innsbruck, who does a little bit of everything, I am told, is a historian of the ancient Near East and was quite excited to be speaking to us about ancient Near Eastern monuments and their cultural recycling from Herodotus and, oh my gosh, I can't pronounce that.
It's just Herodotus to change.
In just Herodotus, that's, thank you for the those of us with different educations. That's helpful. And then our second and final formal speaker this evening will be Jonathan Ben Dov from the University of Haifa, a biblical scholar who works on Second Temple period things and ancient Near Eastern history, who will be speaking about transformations of Neo-Babylonian reliefs in the Jewish literary imagination. Please join me in welcoming Robert Rollinger, and I hope everyone has a handout.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you also very much to the organizer for inviting me to this wonderful meeting. As Felipe already said, I changed a little bit my topic, and I'm really happy that the organizers forced me again to have a closer look on Herodotus within the scope of this conference, and I immediately realized that dealing with Herodotus is just enough, and because there's a lot of stuff in it. So everybody of you should have a handout, and as you can immediately recognize, I'm not an archaeologist. That way you do not have a PowerPoint but a handout. But the handout will help you to follow me, especially to those who are not so much familiar with Herodotus and his work. So, in this paper, I will focus on ancient Eastern monuments and inscriptions as landmarks and their interpretation or reinterpretation by one of the most influential classical historians. In Herodotus' histories, monuments and inscriptions play an important role as discursive markers in creating authentication and meaning. The testimonies are conspicuously tied upon the Eastern Asiatic empires and testify for a mental map that intrinsically connects the ancient Near Eastern worlds and their kings with the production of monuments and texts. In his histories, Herodotus mentions several anthropogenic monuments that bear a specific meaning as a landmark. They are designated by the Greek terms typos or stele, and in a broad sense refer to monuments that, from a modern perspective, can be described as relief, stele, pillar, or even statue. Many of them bear inscriptions whose description follows general principles that can be observed all over the histories, when Herodotus addresses inscribed monuments like tombs and statues. If he provides further information on the texts, he never mentions explicitly the languages, but details the characters, Grammata Hiera Aegyptia, Grammata Assyria, and so on. Let us first have a look at the relevant passages in the histories. For typos, the first term, as model or figure, there are 8 attestations in the histories, and we have the chart in your handout. You can see it covers regions like Egypt, Ionia, and Persia. So with only one exception, and this is the very first example, the term always refers to anthropoid monuments of stone. Only the first example on your handout hints at a rather different context. It is not only the sole attestation where the term characterizes a wooden object, but it also alludes to a different subject, that is, a general description of local customs and practices. Thus, it does not designate a monument, but an object. All other attestations call royal monuments of stone. However, only one of them, the 2 typi in Ionia, can be described as a landmark, that is, as a monument consciously placed at a specific location in the landscape. It is also the only typos which refers to a rock relief, and by the way, the only reference of a rock relief in the entire histories, or the only reference to a rock relief where we can be sure that it is a rock relief. With one exception, all the other attestations qualify temple reliefs, either in the temple of Hephaestus in Memphis, the Artemis Bubastis temple in Bubastis, or the famous labyrinth beyond the lake of Moiris. Darius Typos Litinos, this is the last example on your handout, is exceptional since it is not only really clear whether it refers to a statue or a relief, and since Herodotus does not provide any information about the site of its installation. It is also the only typos related to a Persian king and localized somewhere in Persia. All other monuments either originate from Egypt or are somehow connected to Egypt. So let's have a look at the second term. The term stele in Greek designates again in a broad sense three pillar, that is pillar or stele stricto sensu. As an anthropogenic monument, it appears 16 times in the histories. There are other attestations like the pillars of Heracles referring to Gibraltar, but these are different ones. So as you can see again, you have the attestations cover different areas from Phoenice to Ethiopia, Egypt, Bosporus, and some Greek examples, as well as far as the famous stele attested or erected at the battlefield of Thermopylae. And you can see again the strong or the very important attestations, and a lot of them dealing with Egypt. Again, so let's scan this evidence. Again, there is one case with three references where stele qualifies an object and refers to the topic of local customs and practices. These are the examples related to Ethiopia in the third book. Interestingly, like the Xylinos typos, the wooden one in the second book, it refers to a funerary context and objects made out of a special fabric. This also applies for the two pillars in the Temple of Heracles at Tyre, which are of refined gold and emerald. This is a monument indeed, but together with the Ethiopian stele, it is the only one that is not set up at a specific site in the landscape. All other stelae are clearly freestanding monuments set up at specific sites by a king or another authority. All of them bear inscriptions and are connected to specific historical events. Although none of them is localized in Egypt, many of them exhibit an Egyptian connection. They are generally localized all over Asia and Europe. They have been set up by Egyptian, Persian, and Lydian kings, but also by Greek authorities. They are related to war and royal campaign and are mainly used as markers of border, expansion, and triumph. The two Greek examples, that is those initialized by Greek authorities in Samos and Thermopylae, obviously fall out of the series in this respect. One may interpret them as monuments memorizing a moral victory, but actually they memorize dead comrades and heroes who lost their lives in battles that were, at least superficially, not successful ones. Let us now draw our attention to some specific cases. As we have seen, the attestations for typos and stele in the histories exhibit a remarkable connection to Egypt, and more precisely to the Egyptian pharaoh Sesostris. This is astonishing, since the general outline of the histories is very much focused on the conquests and wars of the Persian kings, from Cyrus to Xerxes, with its climax in the campaigns of the latter that covers the last three books, that is about 1/3 of Herodotus' presentation. Neither Cyrus, Cambyses, nor Xerxes set up any typos or stele. Of course, one may argue that the erection of a stele litu at the reef called Myrmex in the very north of Euboea was ordered by the great king, but Herodotus does not give a clear indication for this interpretation. However, there is one Persian king who is indeed engaged in erecting stele and typoi, and who appears to be presented as a kind of counterpart to Sesostris and the Egyptian dominance. This is of course Darius, who not only orders the typos litinos in the third book to be set up, but also two steles that mark his expansionist plans towards the west. This somehow constructed opposition between Darius and Sesostris is important, since it goes beyond superficial just opposition, and it also relates to details. Darius and Sesostris are the only kings who erect monuments far beyond their home countries. Those of the Egyptian king cover the entire Middle East. Herodotus mentions this fact sweepingly when he informs about Sesostris' campaigns, but he becomes more precise when he focuses on a region that was crucial for the histories, that is, the border between Asia and Europe. As we learn not only from Herodotus, but also from Aeschylus, this border was regarded to present a divine frontier, the crossing of which signaled hubris and divine sanctions. The disaster of Darius' Scythian as well as Xerxes' Greek campaign strikingly testify this conception. Thus, when Herodotus has Sesostris' march, I quote, over the mainland till he had passed from Asia to Europe and subdued the Scythians and Thracians in the second book, this passage gains momentum. This becomes clear when we look at Sesostris' counterpart, Darius, who erects his stelae in exactly the same region. The stelae at the Bosporus mark the crossing of Darius' army from Asia to Europe, and the stele at the river Tearus has to be localized somewhere in Thrace. Thus, when Herodotus provides information where Sesostris and Darius set up royal monuments, he does so for the very same regions. These are key regions for the Persian wars, and at closer inspection, it is exactly the area where the Persian claim to rule the entire world fails. Darius' monuments of victory and expansion are this way transformed by the histories into a discourse of failure and hubris. In reverse, this implies for the two monuments set up by Greek authorities at Thermopylae and Samos that only superficially are monuments of defeat and loss. Both monuments parallel Darius' stelae, but from a different perspective. At the end, they became monuments of victory and triumph, and were still standing when the histories were published. Darius' monuments disappeared. They were transferred and reused. According to Herodotus, time is an essential element in evaluating historical processes. As we have observed, monuments gain a specific momentum in this Herodotean discourse. But what role does Sesostris and his monuments play in this context? Sesostris' monuments are only partly gone, according to Herodotus. Some are supposed to be still visible. Herodotus pretends to have used them consciously as a source for his historical narrative. So the first example on your handout, which I quote, Book 2, 103, "Thus far and no farther, I think, did the Egyptian army went, for the stelae can be seen in their country, but in none beyond it." End of quote.
We are missing page 4, so...
You are missing page 4?
Yes. So just read a bit more slowly.
So then, Felipe, you copied only one side and not both sides, but those who have the original, which is mine, you should have all of them. So, yes. So you can have text critique. You have mine, and I'm sorry for that, but there should be some which cover both. So, okay, you have it. So now, you can follow. In contrast to Darius, Sesostris is a successful king. He campaigned successfully against the Scythians, and some of his stelae are still standing, not only in Thrace and Scythia, but also in Scythian Palestine, where Herodotus allegedly saw them by himself. In contrast to the Persians, he also successfully ruled over Ethiopia, according to Herodotus, and other border areas of the Oikumene, like the region around the river Phasis. It is interesting to note that the Ethiopian stelae in the third book, 324, that characterize funerary monuments, only at the first glance have nothing to do with this kind of discourse. For these objects, and this is, I think, very, very important, for these objects are shown by the Ethiopian king to the so-called fish eaters, who have been sent to him by Cambyses. They are sent with the pretext of bringing gifts, but in truth, the Persian despot intends to gain information for a subsequent attack. The fish eaters' report about the Ethiopian Mundus Inversus is followed by the Persian king's campaign against his most southern neighbors. No surprise, this campaign ends in a disaster. Seen through this lens, the Ethiopian stelae suddenly gain meaning. Whereas greedy and excessive kings seek to use these stelae, as markers of victory and triumph at the distant borders of the oikumene in order to celebrate their expansionist agenda, the Ethiopian mundus inversus, that is by itself localized at the fringes of the world, demonstrates that stelae could be used in a completely different and, one would like to say, more adequate way. It is at these southern fringes of the world where people become 120 years old, the prisoners are bound with fetters of gold, and where Cambyses' precious gifts are revealed as being useless bric-a-brac, with the exception of the jar of palm wine, which is appreciated. Where the Ethiopian king tells his Persian counterpart via the fish eaters a lesson, this is the second quotation on your handout, book 3:21, nor is your king a righteous man, for were he such, he would not have coveted any country other than his own, nor would he now try to enslave men who have done him no wrong. As part of the lesson, the Ethiopian king passes a special gift for Cambyses to the fish eaters. The next passage, which I quote, now give him, to Cambyses, this bow and this message. The king of the Ethiopians counsels the king of the Persians, when the Persians can draw a bow of this greatness as easily as I do, then you bring overwhelming odds to attack the long-lived Ethiopians. But till then, to think the gods who put it not in the minds of the sons of the Ethiopians to win more territory than they have. End of quote. The message of the Ethiopian king is of central importance for the anti-imperialistic agenda of the histories, and in our context, the role royal monuments are to play in this respect. There are not only connecting lines to the Persian kings, but also to Sesostris, the only Egyptian king who ruled over Ethiopia, according to Herodotus. It needs no further explanation that Sesostris and his monuments reveal an imperialistic agenda that unite the northernmost, Scythia, and southernmost, Ethiopia regions of the Oikumene under the rule of one single man. These are, by the way, exactly those regions where the Persian conquests alarmingly fail. As opposed to his imperialistic successors, Sesostris subdued every nation to which he came, according to Herodotus. In this context, we learn from two different categories of monuments of the Egyptian pharaoh. The first ones are his stelae. These are characterized by Herodotus in a very specific way. So, next quote on your handout, book 2, 102. I quote, when those that he met were valiant men and strove hard to freedom, he set up stelae in their land, whereon the inscription showed his own name and his countries, and how he had overcome them with his power. But when the cities had made no resistance and been easily taken, then he put an inscription on the stelae, even as he had done where the nations were brave. But he also drew on them the privy parts or genitals of a woman, wishing to show clearly that the people were cowardly. End of quote. We will come back to this somehow sarcastic motive. The second category of monuments are probably the most famous ones. It is the two typoi in Petresi in Kekalomenai that the king erected in Ionia and described in some detail by Herodotus. The discourse on these monuments has just recently been dealt with in great detail in a very convincing manner by Valeria and Felipe. The two authors demonstrated that Herodotus is reflecting a debate revolving around the problem of historizing the rock relief of Karabel. There were competing interpretations, one pro-Persian that connected the relief with Memnon, who was somehow related to the royal palace of Susa, and one anti-Persian that saw Sesostris as the initiator of the relief. According to the two colleagues, I quote, the monuments of the Egyptian pharaoh were ancestral confirmation that the Persians were usurpers in Ionia, whereas the Greek-speaking collaborators of the Persians produced histories of Anatolia and the Mediterranean world that legitimized their own response to Persian power. End of quote. This is an absolutely persuasive analysis, as one can only agree with the two authors' approach, who focus on the discourse connected with these monuments and ignore the unpleasant question whether Herodotus is wrong or right. However, Herodotus is not only reflecting a contemporary debate and, against this background, developing his own position and way of reasoning, but he transfers the whole story into his historical conception. That the monument has a specific connotation immediately becomes apparent when one looks at the table with the attestations for typos and stele in the histories, and you have it on your handout. The monument, which represents the only rock relief in the histories, does not really fit into the range of these attestations. All other anthropogenic monuments of this kind are either localized on borders, at the distant fringes of the oikumene, or are related to specific stories exemplifying the imperial agenda, the claim for conquest, and the dark side of despotic power. This is different with the typos in Ionia, and I would like to add that this is one further and very strong argument for the author's interpretation that Herodotus' description reflects competing regional debates on a very specific monument. However, I would doubt, and as far as I can see the two colleagues are not arguing this way, that Herodotus' conclusion that Sesostris is the author of the monument implies that he is intended to question the legitimacy of Persian rule in Ionia or Anatolia. What he wants to demonstrate is his way of reasoning about the past, its exploration and dealing with historiae, his notion that the typos has an inscription in Grammata Hiera Aegyptia, and his observation that the equipment is both Egyptian and Ethiopian, as he says himself, are the main arguments why he, Herodotus, connects the typos with Sesostris and his conquests. At the same time, Herodotus tries hard to include the monument into the general discourse of the histories. The localization of the two monuments, one on the road from Ephesus to Phocaia and the other on that from Sardis to Smyrna, as he says, recalls the royal road that runs from Susa to Sardis, but also the south-north connection that can be related to Sesostris' campaign. The Ethiopian equipment calls to mind Sesostris' southernmost conquest, as well as the imperial discourse based upon the Ethiopian logos. It is this connection that unequivocally demonstrates that Herodotus' decision to ascribe the monument to Sesostris cannot be equated with Herodotus allegedly joining a pro-Sesostris faction. For there is critique on Sesostris in the histories and his imperial agenda also in Herodotus' work. We remember that the Ethiopian king accused Cambyses for not being a righteous man, I quote again, "For were he such, he would not have coveted any country other than his own, nor could he now try to enslave men who have done him no wrong." End of quote. But this is exactly what Sesostris does. Maybe more successful than the Persians, but nevertheless, he does. As Herodotus does not forget to report, immediately after his description of the rock reliefs, it is the despotic nature of Sesostris' rule that recalls the Ethiopian speech. For on his way home, he, Sesostris, took with him, I quote again, many men of the nations whose countries he had subdued. End of quote. These prisoners have to work as slaves in Egypt, thus suffering hardship. And you have the passage on your handout, Book 2, 108. I quote it. "Sesostris found work, as I shall show, for the multitude which he brought with him from the countries which he had subdued. It was these who dragged the great and long blocks of stone which were brought in this king's reign to the temple of Hephaestus, and it was they who were compelled to dig all the canals which are now in Egypt, and thus, albeit with no such intent, made what was before a land of horses and carts to be now without either." End of quote. Thus Egypt still exhibits the traces of this despotic rule. Transformation of landscape is a significant marker for despotic rule, but also ruthless and unscrupulous behavior towards family members. When returning home from his campaign, Sesostris is faced with an uprising of his brother who sets the house on fire, where Sesostris, his wife, and 6 sons are banqueting. The pharaoh only escapes by sacrificing 2 of his sons, whom he uses as a bridge to pass the firewall. Of course, he also takes revenge on his brother. As we know from the histories, killing one's brother is a major sacrilege. What we learn from this is that Sesostris is as despotic as the Persian kings, and indeed he is parallel with them again and again. The monuments are an important media to illustrate this parallelism. However, as we have already seen, this parallelism is not a balanced one. Sesostris has erected and left much more monuments than Darius, and he has been successful in conquering the fringes of the world, whereas the Persian king was not. The pharaoh's deeds, together with his monuments, only make sense when seen in the light of the Persian campaign and their shortcomings. It is these shortcomings and the discrepancy between the Persian king's claim to rule the world and their failure to do so that is the clue for Sesostris' glorification in the histories. Herodotus makes this point clear also for those of his readers who have not yet understood the wider contexts of these exemplifications. When Darius intends to set up a statue of his own in front of the temple of Hephaestus in Memphis, just in front of those of his famous predecessor, he is admonished by an Egyptian priest that this is impossible. Have a look at your handout, I quote, 2:110. But the priest of Hephaestus forbade him, saying that he had achieved nothing equal to the deeds of Sesostris the Egyptian. For Sesostris, he said, had subdued the Scythians, besides as many other nations as Darius had conquered. And Darius had not been able to overcome the Scythians. Therefore, it was not just that Darius should set his statue before the statues of Sesostris, whose achievements he had not equaled. When, as Herodotus says, or adds, Darius, it is said, let the priest have his way, end of quote, this is only because the Sesostris story, as we have it in the histories, together with the monuments we have already discussed, is imbued with a concept designed by Herodotus himself, and that intends to draw general lessons from history. There may already have been Egyptian tales on Sesostris before Herodotus, but it is he who transformed it the way we find it in the histories. Sesostris is a mirror for the Persian ambitions to rule the world, as the Persians are somehow a mirror for the Athenians' ambitions in the last third of the 5th century BCE. All this is about hubris, ignoring borders, subduing other people, the seductions of power, and boasting of one's own superiority and triumph. Of course, this master narrative only worked with ingredients that were based on facts and that were well known by the audience. The steles and monuments are objects of essential importance in this context. They bear significant meanings and are dealt with as witnesses of imperial over-ambition. It is highly probable that one of the stelae made of stone in Ionia refers to the still existing rock relief of Karabel A, as it is clear that comparable monuments existed all over the Middle East. It is also evident that Herodotus and his audience were well aware of the fact that the erection of royal monuments of this kind was a well-established custom in the Asiatic empires, and that the kings of these empires were boasting their claim for ruling the world in inscriptions that were not only distributed within their empires, but also written exactly on these kind of monuments. One of them is the famous Pisitun inscription, we have already heard about it, which Herodotus does not mention, but the content of which he must have been aware of, as the outline of his narration on Cambyses, Smerdis, and Darius proves. There, a characteristic element of ancient Eastern royal propaganda comes to the fore. The kings claimed to have conquered regions none of their predecessors has ever seen. This metaphor of surpassing was widespread, and it becomes evident that Herodotus Sesostris is not only questioning this claim of the Persians, but also mocking it. The monuments are important ingredients in this narrative because their sheer existence reveals the Persian claim to be fake news. As we have seen, this claim is measured according to the blatant and vociferous royal self-presentation. This included the claim of having reached the fringes of the world, or even having transgressed them. A ritual of moving out into the sea was also part of such a demonstration, as we know from ancient Eastern sources. What is more, this claim was performed within a geographical framework the Sesostris narrative exactly fits in. A good example of this conception is the inscription Darius Persepolis H, 4 copies of which have survived. They represent trilingual texts that were part of deposits of the famous Apadana at Persepolis, that is the magnificent reception hall where the Greek king used to receive delegations from all over the empire. You have the text on your handout. I read the 3 lines. This is the kingdom which I behold from the Saka, that is the Scythians, who are beyond Sogdiana, from there as far as Kush, from the Indus as far as Sardis, which Ahura Mazda, the greatest of the gods, bestowed upon me. According to this inscription, the areas at the fringes of the world, but under control of the Persian Achaemenid Empire, are the lands of the Saka, the Scythians, in the northeast, Kush, that is Ethiopia, Nubia in the southwest, India in the southeast, and finally Sardis, that is Lydia, in the northwest. The comparison between the Achaemenid Persian mental map and the one that comes to light in the histories is revealing, especially as it also concerns the monuments. It becomes evident that the large majority of the monuments as markers in the landscape, in the histories, clusters around the Aegean world, or more precisely, around the immediate eastern and northeastern neighbors of the Aegean world. It is true that Sesostris is said to have erected stelae all over the conquered lands, but if it comes to single out specific lands, Herodotus only mentions Thrace, Scythia, Ionia, and what will us concern immediately, Syrian Palestine. In general, with only 2 exceptions, Herodotus alludes to anthropogenic monuments as markers in the landscape only at the western fringes of the Persian Achaemenid Empire. Of course, the 2 exceptions are of special interest. But what comes to the fore in any case is the Greco-centric perspective of the histories, also concerning the erections of stelae and typoi by the ruler of Asiatic empires. It is obvious that this distribution in the histories is not due to historical fact, but due to Herodotean arrangement. This is because these monuments bear meaning, as we have already seen, but this meaning is specifically connected to the Persian Wars and the Persian Achaemenid expansion to the west. Seen against this background, it becomes easily understandable that the most important rock relief of the Persian Empire, together with its monumental inscription, is entirely ignored by Herodotus. Monuments of this kind were not interesting per se for the audience of the histories. In this context, the monument of Pisitun had no relevance, but the stelae that Darius had set up at the Bosporus and at the river Tearus, and the one erected at the northern shores of Euboea, were significant markers for the shortcomings and eventual failure of Persian imperial ambitions. Seen through this lens, it is also of importance that these monuments had disappeared and could not be seen anymore by Herodotus' audience at those places where they had originally been erected. This is in sharp contrast to Sesostris monuments. And this is not only true for the famous 2 typoi in Ionia, but also for some of the pharaoh's stelae. Whether this is based on real historical observations or not is not of interest here. What matters is that this is pertinent to Herodotus' historical conception. The disappearance of Darius' monuments does not only testify the failure of the Persian endeavors to rule the world, but also betray the transience of any human achievements. Even monuments of stone do not guarantee perennial success. The fact that some of Sesostris' monuments are still visible are no contradiction to this guiding principle of the histories. This is not only due to the objective fact that there was 1 or maybe even 2 rock reliefs in Ionia, the origins of which was discussed and interpreted differently. In the histories, the main function of Sesostris campaigns that are exactly localized within coordinates that mark the northern and southern fringes of the Persian imperial mental map is to caricature the Persian claim to rule this entire area. By his deeds, the successful Egyptian pharaoh illustrates the Persian failure. One exception concerning the distribution of the anthropogenic monuments is easily explained. Darius Typos Litinos, in the third book, moves the enthronement of a king to the center, whose reign will have significant repercussions to the West, and whose failure, and that of his son, of course, are presented in the histories as showpieces of futile striving, which, by the way, is metaphorically expressed by the disappearing monuments. The second exception is also of special interest, for it touches a specific notion of the Greeks towards their Asiatic neighbors. As we have observed, some of Sesostris' monuments are allegedly still visible according to Herodotus. That this is testified by his autopsy is only one aspect of the story. The more interesting one is that he claims to have seen such monuments in Syrian Palestine. If we imagine to have Darius Typos Litinos been erected in the palace area in Susa or somewhere else, these are the only anthropogenic monuments of the histories erected in the landscape by an Asiatic king that are not localized in the northwestern frontier zone. One may speculate whether there is a specific relation to the region where Herodotus allegedly came across these monuments. According to the histories, the erection of monuments of this kind announcing conquest and triumph is a characteristic of Asiatic kings, but this is not the only one. Herodotus did not see any monuments of Sesostris, but exactly those, I quote, with the genitals of a woman on it, or on them. At first glance, this attests that the people in this part of the world are cowards and do not know how to fight. But there is also a deeper layer of connotations. In Herodotus' history, Asia in general, but the Levantine world in particular, is a crossroads where the presentation, manipulation, and abnormality of human genitalia interrelate. It is here at Ascalon, the city of Ascalon, where the supposedly oldest temple of heavenly Aphrodite is localized. It is this temple that was plundered by some of those Scythians who, in exactly the opposite direction to Sesostris' campaign, were invading Asia as far as the borders of Egypt. The plunderers were punished by Aphrodite with the female sickness, Telea Nusos, which afflicted not only them, but also their descendants, the Enares. Herodotus' ideas may also have been influenced to some degree by the observation that the transformation from man into women was a familiar topic in the curse formulae of ancient Eastern royal inscriptions. Be that as it may, according to him, the Levantine also held a significant position in the spread of the practice of circumcision between Egypt and the land of the Colchians. Moreover, he also believed that the cult of Dionysos, together with its phallic processions, moved from Egypt via Tyre to Boeotia. Thus, also in this case, the monument becomes a marker for a larger multi-layered narrative that has much more to do with alleged Asiatic aberrations than with the campaign of an Egyptian pharaoh. What Herodotus really saw on Asiatic monuments in Syrian Philistine, or was supposed to have seen, becomes not so relevant seen through this lens. In any case, we can be sure that his male Greek audience was much more obsessed with the idea of female genitalia on these monuments than any Asiatic would ever have been. Thank you for your attention.
We have time for one or two questions before we move on.
How many of those monuments still exist? You alluded to 2 or 3, but
So, no, the one which we are absolutely sure is this monument of Karabel A, where originally have been 2, which we know, but one was destroyed by a road construction. So, and I think, as Philippe and Valeria showed, it's absolutely clear that Herodotus is dealing with this very monument, and that there was a discussion about that monument. The other ones are much more problematic, but this one is absolutely clear, I think.
I wanted to say that it was interesting for me that when I read later Levantine responses to those big, great Mesopotamian or Iranian empires, they are quite similar. I mean, they're similar in some ways.
Yes.
Maybe the idea of despotic rule is not that prominent in them, but the idea of hubris,
Yes.
this is very common. I'll speak about something about that in my talk.
Yes, and crossing borders, which is connected to this idea of hubris, but it's also this kind of, if you think that if it was quite common, that erecting stelae in border regions, as we know from, especially from Neo-Assyrian times, but also in older times, and if you combine that with the claim of the Persian kings to have reigned regions as far as no ancient Eastern king reigned before them, and then you have a look at Herodotus, and then you realize that you have at three fringes of the world, in the north, in the west, and in the south, you have stelae, but none of them was erected by a Persian king. You have it in the very west, the stelae of Heracles, which is Gibraltar, which is natural. You have it to the very south in Ethiopia, where the stelae are funeral monuments, so different. And in the very north, it's Sesostris who erected them, but not the Persians who claimed to have been able to rule the whole world. So this is a kind of, in my opinion, a clear reaction to this kind of claim by the Persian kings.
I have two questions. The first one is whether, besides the focus of the audience, which would be in any case the Aegean, because it's Sapiens, but whether the autopsia, which is one of the main claim of Herodot, might be a part of the selection of what he is telling to us. That's one. The second, out of ignorance. So that's really totally.
Yes.
I know that the Ptolemies got into southern, the Mediterranean coast, at least, of Anatolia, Cyprus, and so on. In the aftermath of the end of the Assyrian Empire, was there any episodes for which we can trace a presence of the Egyptians into Anatolia, to which the Historiola of Sesostris could be attached in any way?
Your first question, of course, autopsy is an important issue in the histories. It's also an important issue of modern scholarship dealing with Herodotus, of course. And I think exactly the monument of Karabel, can only be explained in the way that I think he really saw it, and there was a local discussion about the origins of this monument. So I think this is absolutely clear. In other cases, it's much more difficult, and it becomes much more tricky, especially when Herodotus testifies with autopsy. Things we know of are not possible that way. A very famous example is the myth he is telling about that there is in certain periods an invasion of flying snakes into Egypt, and the invasion is kept outside by the phoenix bird, and then he is seeing the bones of these flying snakes by himself. This creates problems. I just say it that way. The other point you mentioned is, I think this is absolutely clear, that the Sesostris story is a story which might already have been in work in Herodotus' time, but which became even more important after Herodotus, and we can see that in important testimonies, for example, especially in the work of Diodorus, who wrote his world history in the 50s and 40s of the 1st century BCE. And of course, I think that this kind of Egyptian self-consciousness, which was conveyed with this kind of stories, has a good placing, of course, in the time of the rivalry between the Seleucids on the one side and the Ptolemies on the other side. And it would, so to say, it was reused and regained, and we also have demotic texts showing that this kind of stuff was important. It is very difficult to answer the question how much of this Sesostris story was already there in Herodotus' times. I think there must have been elements which he caught up and which he included. But he did not simply copy it, but he integrated in a way into his work which fit to his general conception very well. Of course, it always takes to have a very close look to find out these connections in this literary masterpiece. But I think it's important that we face this challenge. No?
Thank you. If there are further questions, I'll ask you to keep them until afterwards, if that's okay, so that we can stick to time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Are you using PowerPoint or are you?
Yes, I am.
Oh, good.
Should be
I
working.
leave this with you, Jonathan.
Roll. Delete to unroll this computer.
Shall I get you in here?
Yes,
Love
thank
to.
you.
Yeah.
This is
Hi,
working.
Etsy. Okay, so brown. You want to go to? You're good from here.
I can find it. Well, may I begin with, first of all, thanking my co-organizer here. I should say that a meeting of a Bible scholar working with Jewish texts, later Hellenistic Jewish texts, and an archaeologist of the Roman world working with Anatolian material is not the most expectable thing in the world. I am happy that it occurred. We reached out to each other somehow through the web. And so I thank you, Felipe, for making this connection and for putting up the conference together with me. I'm really, as I said, very happy with the results. I should also thank the hosting institution for accepting the idea and supporting it and making it happen. So thank you very much, Joukowsky Institute and other establishments at Brown and in Haifa. Let me begin. So I begin with a section from the Book of Jubilees, a Jewish text originally written in Hebrew in the mid-2nd century BCE. This book is strongly influenced by the apocalyptic tradition and contains much material which had been previously contained in Aramaic writings like the Book of Enoch. These earlier traditions are somewhat played down, one could even say domesticated in the Book of Jubilees. At the same time, the book also encapsulates other motifs known from the Jewish Hellenistic tradition and later also from rabbinic sources. The beginning of chapter 8 of Jubilees discusses Canaan, one of the descendants of Noah. Actually, that Canaan only exists in the Septuagint version of Genesis, not in the Masoretic, but this is not really important for us. So he named him Canaan. When the boy grew up, his father taught him the art of writing. He went to look for a place of his own where he could possess his own city. He found an inscription, which the ancients had incised in a rock. He read what was in it, copied it, and sinned on the basis of what was in it. Since in it was the Watchers' teaching, by which they used to observe the omens of the sun, the moon, and the stars, and every heavenly sign. He wrote it down, but told no one about it, because he was afraid to tell Noah about it, lest he become angry at him about it. Let me just say that the Watchers here are the fallen angels that fell down to humanity in primordial times and sinned with mankind. So this passage is rich with connotations and potential trajectories for the traditions about primordial times. I'll try to look at them one by one. The initial factor to note is the history of civilization in the story of the flood. This motif, which is completely absent from the biblical flood account, was dominant in the cuneiform mythological tradition and took central place also in post-biblical Jewish stories like this one. Civilization was a divine gift to mankind in primordial times. Since all of it was destroyed in the flood, mythographers must explain how it reached post-flood humanity, like Mr. Kainan here. While in Mesopotamia, the ark served as a capsule for preserving civilization, these sources discussed here today have a different solution. In the Jewish apocalyptic tradition, in contrast to Mesopotamia, the gift of civilization was not a benevolent one, but rather a sin committed by fallen angels. They are called here watchers, or in Aramaic, irim. Those who fell from heaven in pre-Diluvian ages. This is a Prometheus-like tradition, presenting a primitivistic attitude to knowledge. Mankind was better off if left stupid and innocent, rather than intelligent and frustrated. Some people might agree to that even today. The original myth is preserved here in Aramaic. It is preserved in Aramaic in the so-called Book of Watchers. So today, preceding the Book of Jubilees by a century or so, today a part of the Book of 1 Enoch. According to that story, the fallen angels sinned not only by taking human wives and committing violence on earth, but also by transmitting knowledge to mankind. The arts of metal making, the arts of cosmetics, very difficult scenes, and the arts of divination, including a strong emphasis on astral divination as reported in the Book of Enoch. Jubilees 8 adds a dimension to the myth of the Watchers, which was not present in earlier accounts. Here, the wisdom of the Watchers was not taught directly to mankind, but rather engraved on stone, where Canaan was able to read it. This legend is known also by Josephus and also by the Phoenician writer Philo of Byblos, and is thus not a uniquely Jewish motif. It was the innovation of Jubilees to connect it with the tradition of the fallen angels and with the flood, and creating this complex in this one single passage that you have on the board. So let me ask, what kind of visual sight did Canaan see, according to this passage? Well, reading this passage numerous times before, I have always conceived it to consist of an imaginary tablet or stele covered with ancient writing. But what if the description is not imaginary, but rather reflects a true, a realistic vision? What especially caught my mind is the element of the sun, moon, and stars, like you have here, together with ancient writing as described in this passage in Jubilees. This iconographic complex is known, actually, from several places in the ancient Levant, where Neo-Babylonian kings have commemorated their achievements by means of monumental inscriptions and monuments, images. See, for example, this monument by Nabunaid, preserved in the Sela of Edom in the south of present-day Jordan. This is a very far away site. Up left, there is that little circle. This is a closer look at the monument. In this relief, most of the writing has already eroded, although scholars were able to read the name of the king Nabunaid in that inscription. Now the king appears here in his traditional Babylonian robe, carrying the rod of kingship and addressing his protective gods, Shamash, Sin, and Ishtar, Venus. This relief contains all the elements mentioned in Jubilees 8, actually. An ancient inscription carrying mysterious knowledge, astral symbols, as well as a mysterious old figure, which I think that some ancient viewers conceived not as a Babylonian king, but rather as a kind of primordial giant, maybe a fallen angel. The author had no way to tell that the reliefs preceded him by 500 years or so, and so he considered the inscription to come from before the flood. The astral symbols were deciphered as indicating astronomy and astrology, the object of teaching on the relief. We should know that residents of the Hellenistic Levant knew nothing actually about the Akkadian language and could not have deciphered the cuneiform script. For them, it was a mysterious language of the ancients. At that time, the ancient Mesopotamians were called Kaldaioi, or Kasdim, and their language was Leshon Kasdim, as it appears in the book of Daniel, the language of the Kasdim, namely Aramaic. The secluded families who kept writing cuneiform in Babylon and Uruk, they were not known outside those cities, and even then, they were not very influential. Accordingly, in the eyes of Assyrian of the Hellenistic period, Nebuchadnezzar was, so any Babylonian king would be supposed to speak Aramaic. If you ask me, this is not very far from the truth, because actually Nebuchadnezzar did, I think, speak Aramaic. But a reader in Syria in the Hellenistic age could not have known about anything other than Aramaic. When he saw these signs of cuneiform, this appeared to be very strange. He was encountering something ancient and mysterious. Mesopotamian kings left monumental cuneiform inscriptions throughout the Levant, and especially in Lebanon, the land of the cedars, where they imprinted their royal insignia and conveyed their imperial ideology. Thus, Sargon the Great, already in the 3rd millennium, as well as Yachdunlim from Mari, Ashurnasirpal, Nebuchadnezzar II, and many others. These kings reached the cedar forest, like Gilgamesh before them. They cleansed their weapons in the Mediterranean Sea and commemorated their acts by erecting monuments in Lebanon. Now, as long as Nebuchadnezzar and Nabunaid and the other kings lived, their message was valid, even if the locals could not read the inscriptions. However, how are these monuments conceived centuries afterwards, 400, 500 years later on, when the glory of the Chaldean dynasty faded into a distant memory? Rock inscriptions, those that we mention here, are unlike other artifacts left from earlier periods. As people in this conference have been advancing the last day or so, these reliefs remain part of the landscape for thousands of years to come. Thus, they serve as hinges for the construction of later traditions, as part of the cultural memory of the specific region in which the reliefs are preserved. These traditions may reflect sometimes the original, if you can still use that word, the original Babylonian setting to some extent, but by definition, they are a new cultural hybrid, combining the old heritage with the mythology and politics of the receiving society. This amalgam is especially prominent in the land of Lebanon, where ancient royal reliefs are particularly prominent. The Jewish traditions of the Watchers, originally in Aramaic, take part in this Levantine mythological hybrid, and they give clear evidence about their own origin in the region north of Judea, namely in the Hermon and Lebanon regions, as we shall see. But one paragraph about Nebuchadnezzar in Lebanon, and then we'll start showing the examples. So, after Nabopolassar defeated the Assyrian Empire but passed away early, his son Nebuchadnezzar secured his own empire by conquering the Levant. Facing a series of rebelling nations and the terrifying shadow of Egypt, he spent most of his reign in Lebanon, commemorating his achievements there by means of erecting monuments, carrying texts or images. Reliefs were discovered in 4 sites in Lebanon, all strategically important or exceptionally dominant. Nar el-Kalb, which we've mentioned, then Brisa, then 2 smaller ones, Wadi Saba and Shir Sanam. I should say that much of these monuments, we owe them to the pioneering and amazing work of Rocio Dariva, who lived in Lebanon for a long while and discovered some of these that were not known before. Even the ones that were known before, she did wonders in reading them despite their horrible situation, as we shall certainly see. So Nar el-Kalb, north of Beirut, is an outstanding site which showcases a whole, I would call it, Disneyland of royal inscriptions, from Ramses II to Napoleon III, with figures like Caracalla and Hadrian in the middle. Esarhaddon left a relief there, as well as other, we've seen that already. Thus, already in the 4th century BCE, one could watch at Nar el-Kalb a whole range of exotic reliefs. Ancient reliefs were a strong part of the collective memory and still are in present-day Lebanon. The site of Brisa is situated to the north of the Baca of Lebanon. It is a strategic passage point from the Baca to the city of Baalbek. The 2 monuments of Brisa, measuring over 2 meters in size, face each other at both sides of the Wadi. This is how the area looked like. How long ago, Robert?
As you said,
It says pre-2005. This is how it looked like. So not much.
I do not remember exactly, but it's
Yes.
about 10 years ago or so.
Yes, so not much has remained from that. As we heard from other speakers, there was a local tradition that a treasure is hidden behind the relief, so people had the motivation to dig behind it. And it should also be said, as Rocio Dariva says, there has been lots of wars and people used these reliefs for practicing, for shooting. Now, following the work by Rocio, then there was some improvement. But luckily for us, they were discovered, Brisa, the site was discovered in the late 19th century. And yes, this is more or less what we see there today. It was discovered in the late 19th century. And we have something like that. There are photos and then some drawings made according to them. So, the Eastern inscription shows a king fighting a lion. Can you see that? Well, on the left, there's the king, the typical Babylonian, Neo-Babylonian king. And here there is a lion attacking him. There's somewhat a better drawing afterwards, but there's a king fighting a lion. At the opposite end, there is a relief with the same text, one of them in Old Babylonian cuneiform, while another one in Neo-Babylonian cuneiform. While in this second relief, the king is standing next to a tree. The full relief before mutilation would have shown the king cutting the tree, as we may gather from the accompanying text. The tree is stripped of leaves and fruits, and in fact consists only of an upright trunk and several branches. This is exactly the shape of the tree that Nebuchadnezzar required for his building projects in Babylonia, which he boasted in the accompanying inscription. That day, Lebanon, the mountain of the cedars, the luxuriant forest, a martyr of sweet smell, whose excellent cedars, which had not been used for the cultic place of another god, and had not been taken for the palace of another king, I cut with my pure hands. And so on, explaining his acts in Lebanon. Other reliefs of Nebuchadnezzar were found in places like Shir Es-Sanam, where an inscription existed next to the king's image with astral symbols, as you can see here. The inscription is by now hopelessly mutilated. And then the site of Wadi Saba probably displayed the same. But then there was a drawing there of the king, once again, the king fighting a lion. The Arabic names of these sites, like Wadi Saba, means the Wadi of the demon or something like that. So there was some local folklore about these sites in later times. Now it is interesting for me, after watching these reliefs, to see that Jewish Aramaic writings preserve a particular connection with the Lebanon environment. Generally speaking, the Book of Watchers, telling us about the fallen angels, declares that the story actually took place in the area of Mount Hermon, just opposite the mountains of Lebanon. They all swore together and bound one another with a curse, and they were, all of them, 200 who descended in the days of Jared onto the peak of Mount Hermon. And they called the mountain Hermon because they swore and bound one another with a curse on it. So there is a word derivation there leading us to the word Hermon. So that purportedly Judean book actually testifies to itself that it has a northern origin in the mountain range of Hermon, just in the area where we are heading to. More specifically, elements from the Lebanon reliefs are developed in the Jewish Aramaic tradition. First and foremost of these is the tree that we've seen where the king was cutting a tree. If in the later Levantine mythological reading, the scene in Brisa of a king standing next to a tree is seen as a fallen angel standing next to a tree, then we encounter a similar scene in Daniel chapter 4. There was a tree at the center of the earth, and so on and so forth. And then verse 13, I continued looking in the visions of my head. This is a dream of Nebuchadnezzar. As I lay in bed, and there was a holy watcher coming down from heaven. He cried aloud and said, cut down the tree and chop off its branches, strip off its foliage and scatter its fruit. Let the animals flee from beneath it and the birds from beneath its branches. A watcher falls from heaven and calls for the destruction of the tree. Now, in the Old Greek translation of this chapter, this is another version of it, and I would say in many ways superior. The tree reaches high to the heavens, touching the sun, moon, and stars. So this latter motif is usually seen as a later addition or embellishment of the scene, but we now see that the sun, moon, and stars are really part of the language of that original scenery. So this scene of cutting a tree, and yes, an angel coming down and cutting a tree, actually fits in a very common motif in the Jewish apocalyptic tradition, where the watchers and their offspring live in a garden. Some of them tending the garden. They are actually acting as gardeners. This is Aramaic literature preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Some of them are tending the garden, just like in Gilgamesh, while others aiming to destroy the garden by flood or by fires. This motif shows remarkable vitality in Jewish apocalypses as late as the 2nd century CE and later. It perfectly fits the Lebanon area, as the cedars of Lebanon were always celebrated, already in the time of Gilgamesh, as the sacred forest guarded by divine beings. We see here the tail end of that myth, wearing a new garb, not from the Mesopotamian point of view, but rather from the Levant. So let us move on to the motif of the king fighting a lion. So we spoke about the tree, but let us speak a little about the king fighting a lion. As we saw in those earlier reliefs in both Brisa and elsewhere. Now, the king fighting a lion is a traditional Mesopotamian motif, especially pronounced in Assyrian art, and I should say somewhat surprising to find in Babylonian art. The meaning of the lion was analyzed by many scholars before me, showing the contrast between civilization and the wild. The king is an agent of civilization, chasing away the evil forces of the wild, and thus reinforcing world order for the benefit of his subjects. While Nebuchadnezzar would not show this relief to his subjects in Babylon, it was good enough to show to the provincials in Lebanon. Now, the same dream in Daniel chapter 4 that we encountered, continues with the king being disposed from his glory and sent on to live with the beasts of the field. You will be driven away from human society, and your dwelling shall be with the wild animals, like we read in Gilgamesh actually. But it still continues to conform to the imagery that we saw in the reliefs. Then there is this other in 1 Enoch chapter 7, where the giants that fall from heaven, the sons of the angels that fall from heaven, were devouring the labor of all the sons of men, and they began to sin against the birds and the beasts of creeping things and the fish, and to devour one another's flesh. So they committed violence against the forces of nature. So they were abusing, it's an interesting motif of abusing the nature, abusing the wild. Once again, in another Aramaic writing from Qumran, a trajectory of the book of Enoch, we hear about the wild beast has come and the wild man they call me. This is a very close trajectory of Gilgamesh, but found there in the Aramaic writings from Qumran. The apocalyptic dreams place special emphasis on the element. So, having finished speaking about this motif of the wild and so wild animals, let us speak of yet another motif. The apocalyptic dreams place special emphasis on the element of ancient writings and their demolition. This motif stands next to the motif of the trees, especially in the so-called Book of Giants, and Enochic composition in Aramaic, known from Qumran, and from various later translations. This book actually has a wonderful history of transmission. It reached all the way to Sogdian in Persian, even near China, somewhere in the late antiquity. This book of giants is well known for preserving the names of Gilgamesh and of Humbaba, in this text being the names of two of the giants. As in the Gilgamesh epic, these giants experience illustrative dreams. Here are the dreams according to one later Jewish transmission. So the dreams of the giants. They dreamed dreams. The one saw a great stone which covered the earth, and the earth was marked all over with lines upon lines of writing. An angel came, and with a knife obliterated all the lines, leaving but 4 letters upon one stone. The other son saw a large pleasure grove planted with all sorts of trees, but angels approached bearing axes, and they felled the trees, sparing a single one with 3 of its branches. So these 2 dreams are wonderfully reminiscent of, well, the Brisa monuments. One dream mentions an old text written on stone with an angel bringing a knife to obliterate it. The other dream mentions the grove with large trees, with angels cutting the trees down. So all together, taking together these 3 motifs and what we find in the drawings, in the monument, and the text that we find, the Jewish Aramaic text, I think we are in the position to trace the early stages of the myth of the Watchers, the fallen angels. Literary, but perhaps also oral, and what is more, iconography. This makes the story of the Watchers, for the first time, a full-fledged myth, on a par with other myths known from antiquity. The visual representation has a stronger effect and endures longer in the collective memory. Well, the giant on the rock is, you can say, half man, half god. It was not conceived as such by the Babylonian king who carved it, but it was certainly so 5 centuries later. This kind of mishvesen mediates between gods and men, while serving as a frightening reminder of primordial and mysterious forces. In some ways, this giant on the rock continues the Mesopotamian myth of Apkallu, so these primordial half men, half fish who brought knowledge to humanity. So this is an interesting case of interpreting a piece of art whose original connotation has perished. Since Levantine authors could not penetrate the original meaning, they had to invent a new one and match new mythology with an old image. There's a difference between the old meaning of their reliefs and their Jewish apocalyptic reception. While in the former they celebrate the king's grandeur upon their subjects, the latter tradition always interprets them as signs of doom. They all symbolize actually that the flood is coming very soon and humanity is going to be destroyed. This is the meaning of the dreams in this reinterpretation in apocalyptic tradition. So much of the original was lost, but still the motifs are still there. The Watchers and Giants represent, on the one hand, the sources of civilization, while on the other hand, they represent excessive violence, which nearly obliterated mankind. These 2 elements merged together to convey what was, for me, quite feasibly, the image of Babylonian kings, or, for that purpose, Persian kings, 500 years after Nebuchadnezzar. They were the source of Chaldean wisdom, while on the other hand, they symbolized imperial violence and hubris, a vice that remained ever relevant in this region of the world. So this observation leads us to see the myth as a longue durée response to imperial ideology. As said, has showed, the weak side depicts the imperial the weak side of the equation needs to use the imperial media in order to express a kind of subversive position. There was a body of Aramaic mythology formed in the Levant. It was not necessarily Jewish. That mythology shared elements with the better known Mesopotamian stories, but preserved them from the side of the oppressed. The Israeli-Dutch scholar Frank Pollack has proved that the Aramaic narratives of Daniel, they constitute the tip of the iceberg of a far wider oral mythological Aramaic tradition. That Aramaic tradition is not reachable to us, but we can trace it through sometime before it and sometime after it, and the way it is preserved in the Jewish writings. When these people viewed the Babylonian reliefs, they must have known that this is the image of a past king. They might have known that this is also a king from Babylonia. They could not tell the difference between Nebuchadnezzar and Nabunaid for that purpose. What they did is connecting these prominent landmarks with the main themes that caught their interest: the origin of civilization, the origin of imperial violence, and the divine role of their beloved Lebanon as the abode of the gods. The visual imagery played a significant part in this mythology. The topography of power, the iconography of power, if you wish, the technology of power, they came together in an elaborate new creation, which is loaded with new meanings. An echo of this local Lebanon myth is preserved, for example, in Philo of Byblos. So this is not a Jewish writer and not a Jewish Aramaic apocalyptic writer, but Philo of Byblos says how they, so the primordial gods, begot sons who in size and in eminence were greater than their fathers, and whose names were given to the mountain ranges which they ruled, so that the Cassios, the Lebanon, the Anti-Lebanon, and the Bratis were called after them. So here is this cultural memory of the giants of old that are commemorated in Lebanon, a stage, a link in the chain that eventually reached those Aramaic texts from Qumran. I'm about to finish, but I still have time? Tons of time. So Aramaic-speaking Jews living in Syria, Lebanon, I was going to say, I'm trying to reconstruct this kind of body of Aramaic mythology, which we hope we can do more about it. But Aramaic Jews Aramaic-speaking Jews living in that area shared this mythology and fashioned it to fit their Jewish needs. Clearly testifying to their northern origin, these Jewish texts connected the mythology with further Jewish motifs, rendering it even more powerful for them. Admittedly, the visual aspect of their reliefs was necessarily diminished in the Jewish transmission, as they developed far away from the actual reliefs in Lebanon. Yet the Jewish apocalyptic tradition succeeded in reinforcing the myth, among other things by ritual undertones. It so happened that the Babylonian reliefs winded up as the triggers for a subsequent Jewish mythological tradition. I think this is a worthy example for the force of imagery and iconography in affecting human conceptions of the world. It is also a demonstration of the force of a geographical landmark in shaping the thought of the people in the region. Finally, it is a lesson in the formation of a cultural memory of a past king. While Jews knew Nebuchadnezzar as the villain who destroyed the Jerusalem temple, if you look at the actual legends that are preserved about Nebuchadnezzar in the Hebrew Bible, they are absolutely rather positive. You would expect that if the historical memory of Nebuchadnezzar was the king who has destroyed the Jerusalem temple, he would be seen as a villain. But actually in the book of Daniel, he's rather seen as a rather benevolent king. The reason for this view of the benevolent Nebuchadnezzar is the Aramaic stories about him that actually served as the Vorlage for what you find later on in the Jewish renderings in the book of Daniel. So this tip of the iceberg of the Aramaic mythological tradition is what I have been trying to reach through this present lecture. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Well, we have time for a question or two. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's very interesting. I want to ask you about the kind of later reception of this of these stories, so particularly the Jubilees passage you mentioned, and whether there is a later tradition of this. The reason I'm asking that is because certainly in the sort of the same story from Josephus is very long lasting. I mean, you get this in early modern histories of science that still say that we know about astronomy because, or the origins of astronomy were these pillars that were from Seth, and they repeat the Josephus story. So was there a similar long acceptance and long story, a long tradition of this story in Jewish writings?
There is this story and the stories around it are very well known in Byzantine sources like Malalas and what's his name? I forgot his Sinkelus and people like that. They're Byzantine Jewish writings. We don't have a lot of them, but several of them. For example, there's a tradition, a Jewish Byzantine tradition about Noach being the origin of medicine. So there's a Jewish Byzantine medicine book which begins with the myth of Noach, how he learned. So not specifically this one, but not specifically astronomy, but rather medicine. But Noach serving as the origin of that kind of science, having received it and preserving it through the flood.
Again, connecting it with physical objects?
Not that I remember. However, that dream that the dream of the giants about the stone that was out there, This is actually preserved. I read it from a Jewish medieval source from Provence of the 11th century. So this kind of apocalyptic material actually did reach medieval Jewish Judaism, although it didn't have much lasting there. It was there for a while, like maybe a century or two, and then it kind of stopped. Please.
Thank you very much for this fascinating talk. You know, this interesting idea that the concept of civilization has to be conserved from before the flood to afterwards the flood. It's already there in the work of Berossos. You know, in Berossos you have this example that there was a tablet found again after the flood in Sippar, and it was recovered and reread, and then, you know, civilization was, so to say, re-established exactly in the sense
Yes.
you were demonstrating to us. And I think this is also an important and very interesting connection to the Mesopotamian world.
Absolutely, you're absolutely right, and it figures well both in Berossos and in Philo of Byblos, and what Josephus tells. There's a tradition in Josephus about two pillars standing in the land of Sirid. It says Sirid. The Greek says Sirid. It's hard to say. It might be Syria. One of them is made of stone, and the other one is made of clay. Because they were supposed to be handled while two floods. The flood was actually consisted of a flood of fire and a flood of water. So the flood of water actually wiped all of whatever was written on the pillar of clay, but then the flood of fire persisted both. So preservation of knowledge is really a theme. It's an important theme that runs through that tradition.
But Berossos might be the oldest testimony for this idea, the oldest as far as I know.
No, Gilgamesh.
Right.
But
Gilgamesh starts out in the standard Babylonian version that he brought back the knowledge from before the flood.
And wrote it on a naru, and so we were able to read it. Yes. So you're right that this is an interesting amalgam of Mesopotamian traditions with Western motifs, and it's a kind of a new hybrid that answers to. But in those later generations, I think a main drive of this hybrid is really what they felt towards the empires. Specifically, I think the empires really pillaged Lebanon in terms of cutting the trees, cutting every possible tree. Nebuchadnezzar really says that. I will leave no tree in this Lebanon, yes, nothing will remain there. And so this remained in the cultural memory of Lebanon, and so found expression in the mythology.
Oh, lovely. In that case, if there are no further questions specifically for Jonathan, I will end the session and invite the organizers to lead a discussion. Is that what you wish to do?
No, I think we're just ending.
Taking an axe and
Stripping all of the branches.
I did write
Oh, good.
just a little note, okay? Please, I'm not going to keep you here much longer, just a few minutes. Well, it occurred to me already when we planned this conference, but much further as I was attending the talks, it just occurred to me that we did hit a chord when picking the theme for this conference. The subject is there. It is ripe for observation. It is ripe for study, because the people sitting here, like Matt, for example, and many others, yes, have discussed that topic already. But it is not one of the well-established themes on which you can find books upon books upon books and heaps of literature. And I felt secure to approach some of the people sitting here and to say, maybe I can raise your curiosity and have you look at it. So you're like Robert and Beatrice, and Lorenzo. I'm very happy that you all took the challenge and did something about it. I think that it's kind of a junction between all sorts of themes that I wrote down, lest I forget. I probably did forget some of them, but I wrote that this is really, I think, a good place to examine the theme of time and temporality, going back in time and forth in time and back in time. This is really fluid with some of these reliefs, time is really fluid, as we've encountered. I think this theme of technology of power and, what is traditionally called propaganda, but is now could be defined in a more elaborate way, really flows up from these reliefs in a very powerful way. I think this thing of reception that everybody speaks about today. Reception has become a very central aim for our observations, and reception of these reliefs is very central and important for them. Reception, reproduction. I think that the question of responses to the empire, it came out from these the two last talks, really, but also from other talks. Yes, post-colonialism is on our verge, and you could apply that question to these sources as well. Materiality of writing. So images and their divine agency. Do these images have divine agency or not? Karen thinks they do not. The world order in general, the creation versus chaos. Continuity of royal traditions like Jen spoke about. Did I leave out anyone? I'm sorry. Pavel. But you, of course, your talk really relates to everything that I said. So altogether, it really seems to me that this is a good ground to start digging, to use an archaeological metaphor. I thank you for taking this challenge and for your contributions, and I look forward to seeing it materialize and taking its due place in scholarship. Thank you very much.